All right, welcome to another video on VROS. Today I want to talk about the geometry of the workspace. And to do that, I dug up a very early stage prototype that I was working on before moving into other directions that eventually turned into the final version of VROS. Now, before I walk you through this one in detail, let's just have a very quick look at the final version so that we have that as a baseline for comparison. Just as a quick refresher, this is of course the final environment that I designed for VROS. You can see it's suggested here by this circular UI element around me. And when I move the windows, they just kind of follow this circular trajectory. Actually, they move on a spherical shape, both horizontally and vertically. It's completely seamless. There's no transitions between any places that these windows can be in, other than from the general workspace here in front of me and this element that I call the bridge. Okay, cool. So now we're back in the early stage prototype. Let me take a quick minute and introduce how this one is different from the final product. Now, first of all, I have to say, you'll see that the recording of this one is going to be a lot shakier. That's because I didn't do all the work to filter very heavily my head movements. So you can see I can really tilt my head, which doesn't actually make for a very comfortable flat recording as a video on a screen. So I'm going to try to keep my head as kind of steady as possible. So you can see, first thing, there's no environment here. I'm basically free floating in this deep space skybox, which is pretty uncomfortable when I look down and I'm just infinitely high up. I have also absolutely no visual reference points to things in the background. So yeah, it is really a very unfinished feel in here. You can see that I was playing around with a quite traditional looking Mac OS type dock in here. This is the much earlier version of the keyboard. I'm currently actually just having a controller here sitting in my lap, which is what defines the position of the keyboard. I didn't have a tracker on my keyboard yet. You can see that some of the environment actually moves around with the keyboard as well. This was an early exploration of, well, what actually happens when I move around on the physical desk that I'm sitting at. What if I want to move what if I want to lean over to the side and move my keyboard closer to me? How many parts of the environment do actually have to move with me? Oops. This is something I ended up not really resolving in the final design because it was just not that important for the general point that I was trying to make. Right now you can see down towards the bottom of the video, I actually have this little picture-in-picture feature too that shows where my mouse cursor is when it is moving close to the edge of my field of view, or actually outside of my field of view. This was like a fun little experiment. You can see if I leave my mouse cursor over here on this orange sleeping bag and then I look away, you can see how my mouse cursor, I can still move around the mouse cursor and possibly select different things in that same window without having to look. I thought this was a fun idea, but it proved to be either quite distracting when it would constantly kind of show up as I'm moving around my mouse. And it's very much a fringe use case that I would really look somewhere else while trying to control something in another window. All right, so most importantly, of course, you can tell there are these work panes that I'm using to pretty much divide up the space and give the space some structure. And this is somewhat of an intuitive, earlier attempt at creating a meaningful space in here, something for people to relate to. It's no surprise that I'm building that up from these flat panes here, because that's much closer to what it feels like to be in a physical office. You know, these panes down here, they feel a bit more like something of a desk. And then this would be either a really large flat screen in front of me, or maybe a wall. And here are other walls, just like you have in your office, where you have whiteboards that you can attach documents to, move things around. You can just have walls that you're working with when you're brainstorming and sharing information, etc. So this felt like a somewhat of a low-hanging fruit idea. And as long as you use it in a very specific way, it's not too bad. So I have these 3 windows here that I can play with. And you can see that as long as I'm using them reasonably straight up in front of me, they just look fine, right? I can make them overlap here. I can prioritize which window I want to have selected, and I can see that completely because they're all sitting on the same flat surface. Oops, there's a rendering bug here. Because they're all sitting on the same flat surface, there's no question about whether or not these windows behave in any strange way. One thing that does happen is when I move things further away from kind of my central straight up field of view here, things are starting to distort quite a lot. Windows are not really facing me very much anymore. The content that's kind of further out on the windows, I mean, basically the further I go away from the central point here, the more things, of course, kind of distort in perspective. Things get smaller. They start feeling like they're really facing away from me. It's not very comfortable to try working in a window that's somewhere over here. Control elements, text labels, etc., all kind of sitting at an angle and kind of disappearing into perspective. So that's the first issue. So in that way, it feels a little bit more limiting to work with these flat panes. Of course, you could argue, all right, well, I would be working mostly straight in front of me, and in that way, there's still a lot of space here that I might not have on a single monitor. But yeah, it's just more limiting. I do have multiple panes in here, so I can also take windows and move them across them. So just like with this pane in front of me here, I have these side panes that I can move a window onto, and as long as I position it in a reasonable place, it feels like this window is really facing me quite neatly, and I can just look at it and work with it. I could take several windows here, and maybe I would have my main work would be going on over here, and then my other things I would have over here. Again, same problem. The moment I move things away further, kind of towards the outer sections of these work panes, both over here and over here, now these windows just feel almost useless because I just wouldn't enjoy working with them at all. Finally, I can move windows onto these panes that are a little bit closer to me. And those I actually like quite a bit. There is definitely a sense of kind of intimacy that comes from grabbing a window and moving it just a little bit closer to you in a way where it faces you a little bit more. That notion, that feeling, that is definitely something I find worth trying to capture. This is not necessarily something that I very much incorporated into my final prototype, partially because it does still come with very specific limitations that you have to respect. For example, it works well with a tiny window like this, but it works, let me just make some room here, it works much less well with a large window, because now I don't even know where my work pane really is anymore. And this content here might start occluding whatever else might be adjacent to it, behind it, etc. Now, of course, it feels like this is fine because I have absolutely not defined whatever else is happening around this work pane. But if there were any important things over here, it might be very awkward to have this large piece of content floating around here. I mean, I would have to severely limit where I can actually move this. So far, maybe there's no life-ending issues with this design. But now let's talk about the really bigger problems. Whenever you have two panes that are essentially, these two are essentially intersecting. It's only that this side, the left pane here, kind of just stops right here at this intersection point. So that's why they don't really look like they're intersecting. But if you just imagine this pane to be, infinitely long, then yes, they would be intersecting. And now, as long as you have your windows move quite individually on these panes, and you're respecting a certain distance between the windows, you don't really have a problem. But the moment you're moving one window beyond this intersection point here of these, you have a huge issue when you do this. Right, so now I'm selecting this window here because I want to see this fully. Right, this is what I'm currently focusing on for work. This is just other content that I have sitting around in these other panes. Now, check out what happens when I move this window further over here. Now, this doesn't visually or geometrically make any sense at all, right? This pane here, the center pane here, is clearly behind the left pane in this section. So the window that moves on it should, of course, be behind these two windows. I can bring these two windows to the foreground, and then it makes more sense, right? This is what it should naturally look like. But naturally looking like doesn't really matter when I, as the user, chose that I wanted to see this window in the foreground. So the system has no choice but showing me this completely, even if it means that it creates this awful depth conflict and just rendering nightmare. Right? It goes the other way around as well, because I can take this window. Let me just move this over here. Here, let's get rid of this guy. Here, let's do it like this. Now, I have this window sitting over here. I'm prioritizing, now I'm selecting this window, so it prioritizes its rendering so that it always shows in front. But now I can, of course, do the inverse and just push this. Now, of course, the intersection between these two panes is right here. I can now move this window further through this one. And it makes more sense if I show it like this way. Oh no, sorry. I mean, look at this. The fact that this part of this small window is still visible geometrically makes absolutely no sense. And so it's really uncomfortable to look at that because you get confused about like, oh, what's actually in front and what's behind. Not to speak that it doesn't look good or helpful or especially useful anyway. The point that I'm trying to make is whenever you have a workspace that's built up from multiple individual flat panes that are all adjacent and that your windows can move across, you have to worry about these points where your window moves from one pane to another, or should at least. Right here, what I chose to do was I'm taking the center point of each window and I'm using that as the reference point to transition from one pane to another. And it's just a really rough jump because at this stage of the prototype, it wasn't so much about creating nice transitions between states or anything. But this is already jarring enough on its own. But I have no choice but just picking a point. Right? I could say, all right, well, what if any part of this window touches any part of the left pane? Should the window just snap over? And then it means I could grab a window all the way over here, and if it just touched the pane here, the whole window would do like some crazy snapping motion over. It would be even more jarring than here with the center point, because at least on the center point, you could say it only kind of pivots like halfway, as opposed to if I made the reference point over here, it would flip over even much further, right? And even if I put this, even if I used a smooth transition for this, it would just feel like my windows are almost like moving on their own constantly. I could also say, well, okay, but what if the reference point is just with the mouse pointer? That would be nicer because at least I can simulate that almost over here. If I grab the window really in its center, it would feel more like this. So at least my mouse pointer wouldn't make this huge jump like it does here. So at least I have more continuous control over the object I'm grabbing with the mouse. But now, depending on where I'm grabbing the window, it would snap over sooner if I grabbed it here, or it would snap over later if I grabbed it all the way in the back. And that means this problem of this kind of strange overlap would sometimes be worse because the window would snap over later, and sometimes it would be a bit better. So really, the only way to resolve this, I mean, I don't want to say the only because it's totally possible I didn't think of all the options, of course. But one way to resolve this in a very solid way is, or I should say a rigid way probably, is that I could kink the windows. And the moment a window transitions from one pane to another, I could literally just kink it here and have this part of the window actually render on this pane, literally with a kink in it. And the further I drag it over, the larger the kinked area would become until eventually the entire window is on this pane. This would resolve these these rendering issues, but it would of course just create a mess of windows that are all kinking all over the place. I mean, imagine trying to edit a text document, and just because you're moving it further to the side, kind of over to the side, now it kinks across two work panes, and you have to read all the text in it with a kink in it. It's just, I mean, it just seems awful. So now one immediate instinct might be to say, well, it's just not enough panes because your kind of transitions and your jumps from one pane to another, the angles between the panes are too big, so this is extra jarring. Let's do 5 panes, or let's do 7 panes, or let's do some panes here horizontally, and then let's do a few panes down here that are facing me better, and then let's do a couple of panes up here that are also facing me. But if you think about it, all you're doing is you're creating smaller and smaller and smaller continuous flat surfaces that your Venus can move on. And you just end up having more and more and more and more kinks in your workspace that your Venus have to jump from one to another. You're just multiplying basically the cases of these creases where Windows either have to have this like rendering situation, or which Windows would have to kink around. Now, if we're talking about a workspace that doesn't only wrap around you horizontally, but also vertically, you could have a situation where a window sits between 3 or more of these panes. And now, I mean, I don't even want to imagine how messy that would look. So this is one of the huge reasons why I moved away from a model where I would have more discrete work panes that are all flat that the windows can move on, and moved towards what I have as my final solution. Okay, so now we're back in the final prototype version of VROS. And now I just want to, again, to compare to what you just saw, show how windows move in here. By making my workspace spherical in shape, because a sphere is completely smooth, my windows don't jump from one flat pane to another, but they just move smoothly around me, and wherever they are positioned, they face me straight up. In my previous video, I went into quite minute detail to how that works and also what the problems were that I needed to solve to actually make that work, so I wouldn't have strange overlap issues. So feel free to go check that out. I'm not going to go into any more detail here, but this is just really a quick explanation for why a simpler workspace, even if it feels like it's leaving some opportunities on the table, might be really beneficial for the sake of just working very simply and intuitively with the content in front of us. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and see you in a few additional videos that I'm planning to upload about some other details of VROS. See ya!